At 2 a.m., Candace Mitchell was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside her military apartment. Before she could react, the door slammed open with a violent crash, and there he was. Frank, her abusive stepfather, with rage in his eyes. But this time, she wasn't alone. With Rick blocking the only exit, Candace knew she was trapped, but she wasn't going down without a fight. The terror she'd faced for years had finally led to this, her moment of survival. Candace's life hadn't been her own for a long time. When Frank entered the picture, everything changed. It started with small things: his smile, his generosity, fixing the roof after her father's death. But soon, he started controlling every part of their lives, manipulating her mother's grief, and isolating her from anyone who could help. Frank made sure Candace's life felt smaller each day. Her mother, once strong and independent, shrank under his control, and Candace, though only a teenager, saw the walls closing in around her. It wasn't just the obvious things, locking the doors, monitoring their calls, or restricting her activities. It was the quiet, invisible control that felt even more suffocating. Frank's cruel ability to break people without leaving a mark became clearer every day. And Rick, his son, wasn't better. He played the good cop to Frank's bad, bringing her books and pretending to care while reporting every detail back to his father. But Candace knew better. She knew Rick was just another tool Frank used to keep her in line. Every time Frank would lose his temper, every time he'd dismiss her concerns, Candace's sense of autonomy began to erode a little more. But she couldn't fight back, not yet. She was stuck, caught in a cycle of fear and silence. But then came the military, a quiet rebellion that had been growing inside her. It was her only chance for freedom. At 17, Candace began secretly researching her options. She'd hear the recruiters' ads on the radio or see the posters around town, but she never thought she could actually do it. Leave her mom. Leave Frank's prison. That thought used to paralyze her. But now, as the months dragged on, it seemed like the only option. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The military represented the one thing Frank couldn't control: her own life. She had to get out. Her escape plan wasn't grandiose, and it wasn't without sacrifice. It was calculated, desperate, and it all boiled down to turning 18. The day she could legally sign up, she would, without hesitation. But the closer it came, the tighter Frank's grip seemed to get. Candace began to notice things. Frank's surveillance of her was escalating. He'd know her grades before she did, know her schedule better than she did. Rick's eyes were always on her, even when she was at school. He'd show up randomly, making small talk, always checking in. The subtlety of it almost made Candace forget how much control Frank had over her life. Rick's presence at school was particularly unsettling. He'd pop up at her classroom, at the cafeteria, lurking around like some kind of ghost. His favorite line was, "Just keeping an eye on family." But Candace knew what he was really doing, keeping her in line. The worst part was how Frank had isolated her mother. At first, Candace didn't realize it, but over time, she saw the gradual transformation. Her mom went from a vibrant, hardworking teacher to a woman who barely spoke, always looking over her shoulder, constantly asking permission for even the simplest things. Frank had her so conditioned that Candace didn't even know where to begin. It was like her mom was gone, replaced by someone weaker, someone who was more afraid of Frank than she was of anything else. Candace was watching her mother slip away, and the horror of it was unbearable. That was when she finally realized what Frank had been doing all along. It wasn't just control, it was possession. Frank had taken everything that made them who they were, her father's memory, their family's happiness, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. And Candace? Well, she was next. He didn't just want her to follow his rules. He wanted her broken. He wanted her silent. And then there was the day Candace finally snapped. It came after one of Frank's typical outbursts. She'd come home from school to find her mom sitting at the kitchen table, looking pale and distant. Frank had stormed out, and Candace could hear the anger in his footsteps as he left the house. But it was the silence that really terrified her. Her mother was silent again, like she was lost in the fog of whatever Frank had done. That was the moment Candace knew she couldn't wait anymore. The escape wasn't just for her anymore, it was for her mom too. She wasn't going to let Frank destroy them both. Candace began making plans. It started small, almost like a game looking for a way out without Frank noticing. She kept her military pamphlets hidden in books, tucked away in her bag. But it wasn't enough to simply run away. She knew Frank would find her. He'd always find her. So, Candace started to make the escape plan more tactical. It was a combination of old-school survival skills and military tactics she'd picked up from her own training. She studied maps, studied routes, and learned what she could about how Frank's control worked. She practiced keeping her cool in tense situations, even if it was only in her head. She read books about how to manage her own fear, how to calm herself down, how to think logically under stress. There were nights when she would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, playing out different escape scenarios in her mind. The perfect escape didn't exist, but she knew, somehow, that she could make one happen. But the real test came when she had to confront her stepfather face to face. Candace had spent years running from his wrath, from the way his eyes would burn with anger, from the sound of his fists slamming against the walls. And now, she couldn't hide anymore. Not physically, not emotionally. Frank was coming for her, and this time, she was going to make him regret it. The night of the confrontation came unexpectedly, like a switch had been flipped. Frank and Rick showed up at her apartment late one night, bursting through the door like a storm. Candace knew instantly what was happening. Frank was furious, but this time, it wasn't just about her this time. It was about her mom. And that was when Candace realized the power she had. In those moments, Candace's military training kicked in. It was second nature to her. Everything she had learned about assessing, evaluating, and responding, every survival tactic, every skill she had developed over the years, suddenly became crucial. She didn't have time to think. She just moved. There was no room for hesitation. Candace had spent years preparing for this, and now she was ready. The adrenaline coursed through her veins as she assessed the situation, her escape plan flashing through her mind. There was no turning back. The door locked behind her. The room small and tight. She could hear Frank's voice, but it didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was what would happen if she didn't act. It all came down to that moment. She had to survive. She had to fight. And for the first time in years, she felt powerful. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was Candace Mitchell, and she was about to change everything. In the chaos of the fight, Candace could hear her own breath, quick and sharp in her ears. Frank's rage had blinded him to her resolve. Every moment of tension built up to this. And as Candace fought back, she realized something even more powerful than survival. She had reclaimed herself. Candace's life before Frank was a world of warmth and laughter, simple pleasures, and memories that never seemed to fade. Growing up in Springfield, Ohio, she and her mom lived a peaceful life in their little ranch house on Maple Street. It was just the three of them, her dad, a hardworking man at the International Harvester plant, and her mom, a third-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary. Candace's childhood was filled with summers of catching fireflies, riding bikes down the street, and her dad's deep belly laughs when they'd sit on the porch watching the sunset. Everything felt safe. Her parents' love for each other was a quiet but undeniable presence in their home. But then, everything changed. One summer day, Candace came home from school to find her dad mowing the lawn, like any other Saturday. But the next thing she knew, he was gone. The heart attack came suddenly one minute. He was on his feet. And the next, he collapsed in front of her. Candace couldn't make sense of it. The funeral felt like a blur. There were casseroles, condolences, people who Candace barely knew telling her it would be okay. But Candace knew it wasn't. She watched her mother crumble in grief, her once bright eyes now dimmed. Her mom seemed to float through life like a ghost, mechanically getting up to teach, coming home, staring blankly at the chair where her dad used to sit. For months, Candace tried to help, but it felt like nothing she did mattered. The grief had swallowed her mother whole. Candace did what she could. She cooked dinners, trying to follow the recipes her dad had taught her. She kept the house tidy, maintained the garden he'd loved. But every attempt to fill the hole her father left seemed futile. She could feel the distance growing between her and her mom, and as the months went by, Candace found herself alone. And that's when Frank entered the picture. It wasn't as if Candace's mom was looking for someone to fill the empty space left by her dad. At least, that's what Candace had thought. But when the roof started leaking during a November storm, Frank appeared at their door, offering to fix it for free. He owned a construction company, Mitchell and Associates. But Candace later learned that most of his workers were undocumented, and Frank paid them under the table. Frank was smooth, his smile practiced, and he knew exactly what to say. He seemed like a knight in shining armor, showing up when they were struggling, offering his help. He'd say things like, "Neighbors help neighbors," and "Your husband was a good man. It's the least I can do." But Candace wasn't fooled. The kindness felt too rehearsed, too calculated. Frank's interest didn't end with the roof. He started coming around more often, fixing the furnace, bringing over groceries when her mom mentioned money was tight. By Christmas, he was joining them for dinner. Candace saw how her mom seemed to brighten when Frank was around. It was like a light had been switched back on. And for a moment, Candace allowed herself to believe that maybe this could be good for her mom. But something felt off. Frank's gaze would linger on Candace a little too long. He'd steer her mom away from phone calls with her sister. He would subtly dismiss the memory of her dad, even suggesting that it was time to move on. But it wasn't until the next year, when Frank and her mom began dating, that Candace realized just how deep his manipulation ran. At first, she tried to be supportive. She wanted her mom to be happy, to see her smile again. But as the relationship progressed, Candace began noticing changes. Slowly, her mom's independent spirit began to fade. Frank had an uncanny ability to make her mom feel weak, like she couldn't handle things without his help. It was as if he was slowly replacing everything Candace's dad had been, a calm, steady presence, with a forceful, domineering one. And Candace began to realize that Frank wasn't just trying to be part of their family, he was trying to take over. Things moved quickly after that. Frank moved in with them, and it was around that time that Candace's mom decided to quit teaching. She said it was too much stress, that Frank could provide for them. Candace didn't understand why her mom would give up her career, the thing that made her feel alive. But Frank convinced her it was for the best. The family started making decisions that didn't seem to belong to them. They opened a joint bank account, which quickly became Frank's account with her mom's name on it. Her mom's car mysteriously developed issues, always at the most inconvenient times, and only Frank's mechanic could fix it. Candace could feel the walls closing in, but it wasn't like there was anyone she could tell. Frank was too smooth, too convincing, and whenever Candace tried to speak up, her mom would just say, "He's just trying to help us. Candace, he's just trying to take care of us." The more time passed, the more Candace could see the subtle but deliberate control Frank had over her mom. Frank's influence didn't just stop with the money or the car repairs. It crept into every corner of their lives. Frank would make comments about how her mom was fragile, how she needed structure, routine. It felt like a slow, suffocating pressure, like Frank was trying to reshape her mom into someone she wasn't. At first, it was small removing photos of her dad, telling Candace that her mom couldn't handle seeing them. But then it became bigger. He started isolating her mom from her family. Phone calls with her sister would go unanswered. Friends stopped coming by. Frank had turned their home into a fortress, a place where only he had control. And Candace, she wasn't immune to it. Rick, Frank's son, became a regular fixture in their lives. He'd show up unannounced, bringing books or acting like he cared about her schoolwork, but Candace knew better. He wasn't there because he cared. He was there because Frank needed to keep tabs on her. Candace quickly learned that Rick wasn't just another victim of Frank's manipulation, he was a willing accomplice. He played the good cop to Frank's bad, making her feel guilty for questioning anything. And while Rick was pretending to be friendly, Frank's control was tightening around her, like a noose slowly pulling tighter. Candace began to realize the extent of Frank's power. It wasn't just that he controlled the house or her mom's life. It was that he had turned their home into a prison. And Candace was the one locked inside it. She would notice how her mom seemed smaller, quieter, as if the woman who had once stood strong and independent had vanished under Frank's thumb. She couldn't even leave the house without asking permission. Her mom, once a teacher who shaped young minds, now spoke in whispers. She would glance nervously at Frank before answering questions, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. Candace hated seeing her mom like this. It was like Frank had drained the life out of her. He had done to her what he was trying to do to Candace. He had made them both invisible. And that's when Candace understood. Frank wasn't just trying to control them. He was trying to break them. He was using manipulation, isolation, and intimidation to turn them into his puppets. And Candace knew she couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let it happen. But it was only when she found those college brochures, torn to pieces in the trash, that Candace realized just how far Frank was willing to go to control her future. She had dreams, and Frank wasn't going to let her have them. That night, as Candace stared at the scraps of paper, she made a decision. If Frank wouldn't let her leave, then she would find a way to escape. She would take control of her life, no matter what. The military recruiter's office was just downtown, next to the pizza place where all the kids hung out. Candace had passed it 100 times, never thinking twice. But now, the thought of it felt like a lifeline. She wasn't sure how she would do it, but she knew one thing for sure: she would get out. She would survive, and she wouldn't let Frank control her any longer. Candace's decision to escape came slowly, a whisper of a thought that turned into a solid, undeniable plan. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow realization that Frank's control over her life had become all-encompassing and that she would have to find a way out if she wanted to survive. The first step was realizing that she could leave. She could escape. She had to. But it wasn't going to be easy. The thought of leaving her mom behind, of abandoning the woman who had slowly faded under Frank's cruelty, weighed heavily on her. But Candace knew, deep down, that staying was no longer an option. Her mother had been trapped long enough, but now it was her turn. The military recruiters had always been there, right under her nose. But it wasn't until Candace turned 17 that she started seeing them differently. It was when she noticed the flyers around town, the ads on the radio, the recruiters standing outside the local grocery store handing out brochures. It was when she saw the faces of soldiers on TV. Proud, strong, independent. She wanted that. More than anything, she wanted freedom. She wanted to escape from Frank's grip and carve out a future that wasn't defined by fear. It was then that she made the decision she would enlist. There was only one problem: she needed her mom's signature. Frank wouldn't sign it. He'd never allow it. But Candace was determined. She knew she had to wait until she was 18. That was the only way. Once she turned 18, she would have the legal right to sign up for the military on her own, without Frank's permission. But as the months dragged on, Frank's control grew tighter. Candace knew she had to be careful. Frank's surveillance of her life had intensified. He knew everything she did, every move she made. Rick was always lurking around. showing up at her school, popping in unexpectedly at home. He was a constant reminder of Frank's watchful eye. Candace's every action was monitored, and it felt suffocating, but that only made her more determined. She couldn't let Frank win. She had to find a way to keep her plans accurate. So Candace became a master of deception. Every moment she wasn't under Frank's watchful eye, she spent plotting her escape. She started hiding things, military brochures stuffed under her mattress, her phone hidden in places she knew Frank wouldn't think to look. She kept a journal in secret, detailing her plans, making lists of what she needed to do. She started saving money, little by little, each dollar a step closer to freedom. Candace didn't know exactly how she was going to get away, but she knew she would. She started practicing in her mind, running through every possible scenario. How would she get to the recruiting office without Frank catching on? How would she slip past his surveillance? She knew it wouldn't be easy. Frank had always been a step ahead, manipulating her, isolating her, controlling every aspect of her life. But Candace wasn't going to be controlled anymore. She couldn't afford to wait. In the meantime, Frank was tightening his grip. He didn't trust Candace anymore, not that he ever had. He began restricting her more and more, cutting off her contact with the outside world. He'd taken her phone away once, replacing it with a landline that only he could monitor. He'd installed cameras inside the house and outside, watching her every move. Candace had no privacy. She had no space of her own. Frank was always there, watching, waiting, controlling. It wasn't just her phone and her room that were under surveillance. Frank had turned the entire house into a prison. He knew every detail of Candace's day, what time she woke up, what time she went to bed, when she left for school, when she came home. He'd installed locks on every door and window. He knew where she went, who she talked to, and what she did every single minute of the day. Candace was suffocating. But the more Frank restricted her, the more it fueled Candace's determination to escape. She couldn't let him win. Not like this, every day. She found new ways to outsmart him. She stopped talking about her dreams, her plans. She learned how to keep a straight face, how to hide her emotions. She became good at hiding her thoughts, pretending to be the obedient stepdaughter Frank wanted her to be. But inside, she was burning with the desire for freedom. She was counting down the days until she turned 18, counting down the moments when she would finally be able to take control of her own life. As Candace's 18th birthday approached, the pressure was building. Frank knew something was off. He had been watching her more closely than ever. Candace had to be more careful than ever. Every move had to be calculated. She had to be smart. She started keeping her escape plan hidden even more, burying it under layers of deception. She kept her journal locked up in a box, hidden in the back of the closet, far out of reach. She hid her savings, hiding small amounts of money wherever she could under her mattress, inside old shoes, in the corners of her drawers. Every dollar was a small victory. As the days dragged on, Candace began to feel the weight of the danger she was in. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her mother. Frank had worked hard to isolate her mom, to make her feel helpless, to make her believe that Candace was the problem. Candace knew that if she didn't leave soon, her mom would never leave. Frank's control was suffocating. He had isolated her mother from her family, from her friends. She was weak, broken, unable to see the truth. But Candace wasn't broken. She refused to be. She had to survive, and she knew that meant taking control of her own destiny. She couldn't rely on anyone else. She couldn't wait for her mother to be strong enough to leave. Candace had to take matters into her own hands. The countdown to her 18th birthday became the countdown to freedom. Every day, she felt the walls closing in tighter and tighter, but she knew that once she was free, there would be no going back. The night before her birthday, Candace stayed up late, going over the final details of her escape. She had everything planned. She had already signed her enlistment papers in secret, forging her mother's signature with the help of a teacher who had become her ally. She had packed a small bag, just enough to get her through the first few days. She knew that once she left, Frank would come after her. But Candace was ready. She was prepared for whatever came next. When the day finally came, Candace woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt before. She had made it. She was finally going to be free. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Frank would fight her every step of the way. But she was ready. She was done being controlled. She was done being afraid. She had spent too many years living under Frank's thumb. That afternoon, Candace slipped out of the house, moving quickly and quietly. Her heart raced as she made her way to the recruiting office. She knew this was it, her one chance. If she could just make it to the office, sign the papers, and get away, she would be free. But as she walked toward the office, Candace felt the weight of the risk she was taking. Frank would never let her go without a fight. But Candace wasn't afraid anymore. She was finally taking control. She knew it wouldn't be easy. It would never be easy. But she also knew that once she signed those papers, once she walked out of that office, there would be no turning back. Candace walked into the recruiting office, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. She signed the papers, and with that, her life was forever changed. She was finally free. And as she walked out of that office, she realized something. She had taken control of her life. She had broken free, and nothing would ever be the same again. It was like something out of a nightmare. Yet Candace had seen it coming. The military base was supposed to be her sanctuary, her escape. But Frank and Rick had found a way in. It was 2 o'clock, when it all started. The sound of Bentley, the military police dog next door, stopped barking. That was the first sign something was wrong. Candace had trained herself to trust her instincts, and when Bentley fell silent, every alarm in her mind went off. Sarah, who had been asleep beside her, was already awake. The room was dark, but Candace didn't need to see it to know what was happening. They were here. Frank and Rick had somehow bypassed base security. Candace's heart raced as the footsteps grew closer. Deliberate. Heavy. They had a purpose, and that purpose was her. Candace quickly shifted into survival mode. Years of training, both military and the kind Frank had imposed on her, taught her how to stay calm under pressure. The door exploded inward with the force of a battering ram. And there they were. Frank's hulking figure filled the doorway, with Rick's shadow looming behind him. The two of them had gotten past base security, which meant they had planned this down to the last detail. They knew where Candace lived. They knew her routine. And now, they were here. The final pieces of their twisted game locked into place. Candace's breath caught in her throat as Frank stepped inside, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The smugness in his tone made her stomach churn. She had been prepared for this moment in her head, but now that it was real, the terror of it hit her like a freight train. Rick stepped in behind Frank, closing the door with a deliberate slowness, sealing them inside. "Nice place," Frank added, his eyes scanning the room. Candace's military housing was modest, but to him, it was another victory. A symbol of how he had wormed his way into her life, no matter where she went. This wasn't just about her freedom anymore. This was about him reminding her who was in control. Candace knew she couldn't hesitate. She had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to act. She quickly moved to position herself between Frank and her mother, who was still huddled behind her, terrified. Candace's mind raced, calculating. The emergency beacon she had hidden in the jewelry box was just a few feet away. The panic button on her nightstand wouldn't be enough. She had already activated the beacon once in the past, but this time, it was different. She had to make sure it sent the message to every security panel on base, alerting every MP, fire team, and medical unit. She needed help, and she needed it fast. "You're violating a protective order and trespassing on federal property," Candace said, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't sure if she believed the words, but they were enough to buy her time. Frank's eyes glinted with malice, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Candace's mother, who stood behind her, a broken shadow of the woman she once was. Frank was beyond caring. He didn't fear the law. He didn't fear anything. He had built his life on fear. And now that Candace had left him behind, he was here to take back control. "Just want to talk to my wife," he said, his voice low and menacing, but the clenched fist told a different story. Privately, Candace's grip tightened on the chair beside her. She wasn't going to let him get any closer. "She's not your property," Candace shot back, her voice firm, the strength she had gained in the military filling her with resolve. "Everything in this house is mine. I paid for it, fed it, clothed it, and I'm not letting you take it from me." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating. Frank stepped closer, a sickening smile spreading across his face. He was playing with her, pushing her limits, testing her resolve. He was used to seeing Candace as the scared girl, the one who had been under his thumb for so long. He was used to controlling her every move, but Candace wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't going to cower. She had fought for this life. She had earned it, and now she was going to protect it. The chaos erupted suddenly, violently. Frank lunged forward, faster than Candace expected, grabbing her by the shoulder and slamming her into the wall. Pictures crashed to the floor, including a framed photo of her deployment ceremony and a picture of her mom from better days. The impact left Candace dazed for a moment, but she didn't lose focus. Frank might have caught her by surprise, but Candace knew how to fight back. She drove her knee up into his thigh. It wasn't the precise strike she had aimed for, but it was enough to make him stagger back. She rolled away, grabbing the desk chair and swinging it between them, putting distance between her and Frank. She could hear the pounding on the door. Rick was outside, making sure the trap was set. He wouldn't come in yet. He was just the enforcer. Frank was the one who wanted to break her. "Let's go," Rick shouted from the other side of the door. Frank looked up, momentarily distracted, and Candace seized the opportunity. She grabbed the emergency beacon, disguised as a jewelry box, and hit the hidden button. 3 quick presses, the distress signal that would send an alert to every military police officer on base, every fire team, every medical unit, every off-duty personnel with a duty to respond. It wasn't just a panic button, it was a trap. Candace had outsmarted them. This time, she wasn't the prey. The sirens went off almost immediately. The entire building seemed to vibrate with the sound of alarms. Red and blue lights flooded through the window, and Candace knew that help was on the way. Frank's face twisted in shock as he realized what had just happened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for this. But the fight wasn't over yet. Frank, his rage growing, lunged for Candace again. She moved to the side, ducking under his grab, but the small space of her apartment didn't give her enough room to fully evade him. He grabbed the desk chair, throwing it aside as if it were a toy, and lunged again. Candace's heart pounded in her chest, but her military training kicked in. She was faster now, more agile than she had ever been in her life. She wasn't the scared girl she used to be. She was a soldier, a fighter. But Frank was a brute, and he wasn't going down without a fight. He grabbed Candace by the ankle, pulling her back toward him. She could hear the rage in his breath, the venom in his voice as he snarled. "You think this ends here?" Candace's fingers found the hidden button on the beacon again, just as Frank's grip tightened on her ankle. The signal went out again, and the sound of sirens grew louder. The military police were almost here. Help was coming. It wasn't just her fight anymore. But Frank wasn't finished. His anger was like a beast, roaring inside him, desperate to break free. Candace felt him drag her back, pulling her toward him with terrifying strength. She had to act fast. She had to break free. She shifted her weight, using the techniques Sarah had taught her. She needed to stay light, stay quick. She couldn't let Frank overpower her. She swung her leg, bringing it up to catch his jaw with a quick, precise strike. It wasn't enough to knock him out, but it made him stumble. That was all she needed. She rolled to the side, grabbed the chair again, and put it between them, using it as a barrier. Then, in the chaos of the fight, she heard the sound of boots pounding on the hallway outside. The military police had arrived. Within moments, the door exploded inward, not with force, but with precision. MPs flooded in, weapons drawn, shouting orders. Frank froze, looking around in confusion as the sound of sirens grew louder. He was trapped. There was no way out. "Hands behind your back," one of the MPs shouted, moving toward Frank with steady authority. Frank, in a daze, looked up at Candace, his eyes still filled with rage. He hadn't broken her. He hadn't won. The MPs took him down with ease, cuffing him as Candace stood, her shoulder aching but her heart full of triumph. It wasn't over yet. Rick was still out there. But Frank had been taken down. It was the beginning of the end. As the MPs led Frank out, Candace turned to her mother. Her mom was standing now, not cowering, not hiding behind Candace. She was standing tall, looking at Frank with a mixture of defiance and relief. Candace's mother had found her voice. "No more," Candace whispered, her voice steady. She had fought for this moment. She had won. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't just her victory. It was her mom's too. Rick wasn't done, but Candace was prepared for what was coming next. He would learn the hard way. They all would. The sirens died down as the MPS cleared the area. Help had arrived, but the battle wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning, and Candace, with her newfound strength, was ready to face whatever came next. The moment Frank was arrested, it felt like a dam had broken. For years, he had ruled their lives with fear, manipulation, and control. His presence had been suffocating, an invisible force that had shaped every part of Candace's existence. But now, as the military police handcuffed him, something shifted. His power, once so absolute, was crumbling. The walls that had protected his reign were shattering, piece by piece. Candace had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming sense of relief that washed over her as she watched the MPS lead him away. For so long, Frank had been the monster in her life, the one who held all the cards. But now, as he was taken into custody, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized was there. Rick, the ever-present enforcer of Frank's will, was taken next. Candace had always known that he was just as complicit in the years of terror they had lived through. But it was his silence, his quiet support of Frank, that had always made him just as dangerous. Watching Rick being dragged into custody, his head hung low, was a moment Candace would never forget. There was no bravado in his step, no defense of his actions, just the stark realization that the man who had once terrified her was now powerless. Candace didn't feel sorry for him, not in the slightest. He had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. As Frank and Rick were taken away, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. The military's response had been swift and precise. The base had locked down in minutes, and security had taken immediate action. The police presence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the isolation Frank had worked so hard to create in their lives. Military personnel moved with purpose, securing the area, questioning witnesses, and documenting everything. It was the kind of response Candace had always dreamed of: professional, organized, and, most importantly, fair. Frank had always relied on fear and control to maintain his power, but now the military had shown that there were consequences to his actions, consequences he could no longer escape. Candace felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she watched Frank and Rick being led out of the building, their hands cuffed, their heads bowed. For so long, it had seemed impossible that they would ever face real consequences for what they had done. But now, in the cold light of the military's response, their power was exposed for what it truly was: empty. Frank had spent years convincing himself that he could control everything, that he could manipulate people into doing his bidding. But now, as he was marched out in front of her, Candace saw him for what he truly was: weak. His influence, built on fear and lies, had finally shattered. And in that moment, Candace realized that she wasn't the only one who had been trapped. He had been, too. But it wasn't just Frank's downfall that made this moment so significant. It was the way her mother had changed. For so long, Candace had watched her mother shrink under Frank's control, her strength fading, her spirit broken. But now, in the aftermath of Frank's arrest, Candace saw something different in her mom's eyes. It was like a switch had been flipped. Her mother stood taller, her shoulders more square. There was a fire in her gaze that Candace hadn't seen in years. It was as if Frank's arrest had given her the strength to reclaim her life. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a survivor. And Candace, watching her mother, felt a deep sense of pride. The woman who had once been so lost was finding her way again. Candace walked over to her mother, who was now sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. There was a quiet moment of understanding between them, a recognition of what they had both been through. It was a moment that neither of them would ever forget. Frank had taken so much from them. But now, as the military's response unfolded, they were finally taking something back control. For the first time in years, Candace felt like she could breathe again. Her mother, who had once been a shell of the woman she had been, was standing strong beside her. Together, they had survived, and now it was time to heal. As Candace watched Frank and Rick being driven away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The man who had tormented her, who had broken her mother, was gone, and in his place was a sense of possibility. Candace had spent so many years fighting for freedom, for the chance to escape, but now she realized that she had already won. The real victory wasn't in running away, it was in standing tall, facing her fears, and surviving. She had taken control of her life, and no one, not even Frank, could take that from her. For the first time in years, Candace felt like she could look ahead without the shadow of fear hanging over her. Frank's arrest was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The healing would take time, but Candace was ready for it. She was no longer the scared girl who had been trapped by Frank's abuse. She was a soldier, a fighter, a survivor. And as she stood beside her mother, watching the MPs finish their work, Candace knew that she had earned her freedom. It had taken everything she had: years of fear, pain, and sacrifice, but she had finally broken free. And now, she was going to rebuild her life. Her mother, too, had a long road ahead of her. But Candace was no longer worried about her. She had seen her mother's strength return, and that was enough. They would rebuild together. They would face the challenges of healing together. But they would do it side by side. Candace had always believed in the power of family. But now, she understood it in a way she never had before. Real family didn't just support you when things were easy. Real family was there for you when everything else fell apart. And that's exactly what Candace had now: real family. As the base began to return to normal, Candace walked outside into the early morning light. The air was crisp, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The chaos was over. The nightmare was finally behind her. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was free. And with that freedom, she was ready to face whatever came next. She knew there would be challenges ahead, there always were, but she also knew that she had the strength to overcome them. She had already survived the hardest part, and now, with her mother beside her and her own strength renewed, Candace was ready to start the next chapter of her life. As she stood there, the sun beginning to rise, Candace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had been through lift from her shoulders. She was free. She had made it, and no one, not Frank, not Rick, no one could take that from her. She had earned her place in the world, and now, with a renewed sense of purpose and the power of her family by her side, Candace knew that she was unstoppable. As Candace and her mother begin to rebuild their lives, they find strength in each other and the support of their true family, those who stand by you when the world tries to break you. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of survival and strength. Together, we can rise above the darkness and find the light, resilience, and community. This is what makes us unbreakable.